Close your eyes, or let them rest half open, whatever feels right tonight. We're going to travel far from here, back more than 1600 years, to the north coast of Africa, to a small town called Thagast, where a child was born who would grow into one of the most restless, most searching minds the world has ever known. His name was Augustine. Centuries later, the world would call him Saint Augustine of Hippo. Tonight, you don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to hold on to the names, or the dates, or the arguments. Just let it all drift past you, slowly, like a tide moving in and out in the dark. Take a slow breath in. And let it out even more slowly. Let's begin. Augustine was born in the year 354, in Roman North Africa, in a world that still thought of itself as eternal, though it was already beginning, quietly, to come apart. His mother, Monica, was a devout Christian, a woman of deep and patient faith, who prayed for her son for years before her prayers seemed to be answered. His father, Patricius, was not a believer, at least not for most of his life, a man of the old Roman world, more concerned with his son's career than his son's soul. Augustine was, from the beginning, brilliant. Quick with language, quick with argument, the kind of boy teachers either loved or found unbearable. He was sent away to study, first to nearby towns, and later to the great city of Carthage, to learn rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech, the skill that could open doors in the Roman world the way money or birth could not. But even as a student, even as a clever and ambitious young man, Augustine carried something heavier underneath the surface. In his later writings, he would look back on this time and describe a strange, aching restlessness, a sense that something was missing, though he could not have said what. He tells a small story from his boyhood that he returns to again and again in his later reflections. One night, as a teenager, he and a group of friends stole pears from a neighbor's tree, not because they were hungry, not because the pears were especially good, but simply for the thrill of doing something forbidden. He threw most of the fruit to the pigs. He didn't even want it. Years later, this tiny, almost meaningless act troubled him more than many of his larger sins. He asked himself, why did I do something wrong simply because it was wrong? Not for pleasure, not for gain, but almost for the sake of the wrongness itself. It became, for him, a small window into something much larger about human nature, the strange pull toward disorder that seems to live inside all of us, quietly, beneath our better intentions. In Carthage, Augustine's life became fuller and more complicated. He entered into a relationship with a woman whose name he never records in his writings, and they had a son together, whom Augustine named Adiadotus, meaning given by God. Augustine loved his son deeply, and later wrote about him with tenderness and pride, describing him as unusually intelligent, almost unsettling in how quickly his mind grasped difficult ideas. But alongside this life, Augustine's mind kept searching for something to believe in, something solid enough to hold. He read widely, and one book in particular changed the direction of his thinking, a now-lost work by the Roman philosopher Cicero, which stirred in him a hunger not just for clever words, but for wisdom itself, for truth, whatever that word might mean. He turned first to Christianity, the faith of his mother, but he found the Latin scriptures of his time rough and unpolished compared to the elegant philosophy he had been trained to admire, and he set it aside, unsatisfied, still searching. For nearly a decade, Augustine followed a religious movement called Manichaeism. It offered him something that felt, at the time, like an answer. The Manichaeans taught that the universe was a battlefield between two eternal forces, light and darkness, good and evil, locked in permanent struggle. Human beings, in this view, were caught in the middle, sparks of light trapped inside bodies made of darkness. There was something almost comforting in this picture, because it meant that Augustine's own inner conflict, his sense of doing things he didn't want to do, wasn't entirely his fault. It was the darkness within him, fighting against the light. He didn't have to take full responsibility for his own restlessness and failures. Something else could be blamed. But slowly, over years, the answers stopped satisfying him. The Manichaean teachers couldn't answer his harder questions. Their explanations of the natural world didn't match what he was learning from astronomy. And underneath it all, that same old ache remained, unresolved, patient, waiting. Augustine moved to Rome, and then to Milan, chasing a career, chasing prestige, still chasing whatever it was he thought he needed to feel whole. In Milan, he encountered a Christian bishop named Ambrose, a man of extraordinary eloquence, and for the first time, Augustine heard Christian scripture explained not as a simple, unsophisticated text, but as something with depth, with layers of meaning beneath the surface, capable of standing beside the great philosophy he had studied his whole life. Around this same time, Augustine also encountered a body of thought called Neoplatonism, especially the writings of a philosopher named Plotinus. Neoplatonism offered Augustine something new, a vision of reality where the highest truth was not made of matter at all, but was purely spiritual, a kind of infinite light or unity from which everything else flowed downward, like ripples spreading out from a single source. This was, for Augustine, an enormous shift. Until then, he had struggled to imagine anything that wasn't physical, that didn't take up space, that couldn't be pictured with the eyes. The Neoplatonists gave him a way to think about a God who was not a large being made of light somewhere in the sky, but something entirely beyond physical existence altogether, closer, in a strange way, than anything material could ever be. Slowly, painfully, Augustine's old certainties kept dissolving. He could no longer believe what the Manichaeans taught. He was drawn, more and more, toward Christian faith, intellectually convinced, or nearly convinced. But something still held him back, something deeper than argument. He later described this inner state with startling honesty. He said that he wanted to change his life, and yet he didn't fully want it. Part of him longed for a different way of living, and part of him still clung to his old habits, his old pleasures, his old identity. He famously admitted that he had once prayed, "Give me chastity, and give me self-control, but not yet." This is one of the most human moments in all of Augustine's writing. Anyone who has ever wanted to change and also, quietly, not wanted to change, will recognize something of themselves in this divided heart. Wanting and not wanting, at the very same time. The breaking point came in a garden in Milan. Augustine was there with a close friend, and he was in an agony of indecision, torn apart by his own inner conflict, weeping, unable to move forward and unable to stay where he was. He got up and walked further into the garden alone, and threw himself down under a fig tree, crying. And then, he says, he heard a voice, a child's voice, from a nearby house, repeating a simple phrase over and over, almost like a children's game, "Take up and read, take up and read." He couldn't remember ever hearing that phrase used in any child's game before. He took it as a sign. He went back to where his friend was sitting, picked up a book of Paul's letters that had been lying there, opened it at random, and read the first passage his eyes landed on. In that moment, he says, it was as though a light of certainty poured into his heart, and all the darkness of his former doubt was scattered away. It wasn't a thunderclap. It wasn't a vision in the sky. It was quiet, almost embarrassingly small, a child's voice, an old book, a random page. And yet, for Augustine, it was the end of a search that had taken most of his adult life. Not long after, Augustine was baptized, together with his son Adeodatus, and his close friend Alypius, in Milan, by the Bishop Ambrose himself. He resigned from his teaching position, gave up his ambitions for a public career, and began preparing to return home to Africa, no longer chasing status, no longer chasing the approval of powerful men. Before they set out, Augustine and his mother Monica shared a quiet moment together in the port town of Ostia, looking out toward the sea, talking about what eternal life might be like, what it might mean for the soul to rest, finally, beyond time altogether. Augustine describes this conversation as a kind of shared glimpse of something vast, wordless, and calm, a brief touching of eternity, before the ordinary noise of the world rushed back in. Shortly afterward, Monica became ill and died, far from her homeland, but at peace, having lived to see her son come to the faith she had prayed for across so many long years. Augustine grieved deeply, and wrote about her death with a tenderness that still feels close and immediate, even after all these centuries. Augustine returned to Africa, intending to live a quiet life of study and reflection. But the Christian community in the coastal city of Hippo had other plans. During a visit, he was more or less pulled forward by the congregation and ordained a priest almost against his will, weeping, he says, at the weight of the responsibility being placed on him. Years later, he became Bishop of Hippo, a position he held for the rest of his life, preaching, writing, arguing, comforting, and thinking, always thinking. It's from this later period of his life that Augustine produced the works that would shape Western thought for the next 1,000 years and more. And it's here that we can slow down, and sit for a while with some of the ideas he spent his life turning over. One of the questions that fascinated Augustine most was the nature of memory. He describes memory as an enormous inner space, a vast palace with countless halls and rooms, storing not only facts and images, but feelings, skills, forgotten fears, half-remembered joys. He marvels at how he can, in an instant, summon the image of a mountain he once saw, or the sound of a voice from years before, all without those things actually being present at all. He wonders at the strangeness of this. Where, exactly, are these memories kept? What is this space that has no physical size, and yet somehow holds an entire lifetime inside it? He even wonders about the memory of forgetting itself, how strange it is that we can remember the experience of trying, and failing, to remember something. You carry a palace like this too. Every face you've ever loved, every ordinary afternoon, every small ache and every small joy, stored somewhere inside you, waiting quietly in the dark, ready to surface the moment you turn your attention toward it. Alongside memory, Augustine turned his attention to time itself, and asked one of the most famous questions in the history of philosophy. What is time? He admits, with disarming honesty, that if no one asks him, he knows perfectly well what time is. But the moment someone asks him to explain it, the answer slips away. He notices something strange. The past no longer exists, it exists only as memory in the present. The future does not yet exist, it exists only as expectation, as anticipation, in the present. And the present itself is so brief, so impossibly thin, that by the time we try to notice it, it has already become the past. So where does time actually live, if not in the mind itself? Augustine suggests that time may not be something that exists purely outside of us, ticking along independently of everyone, but rather a kind of stretching of the soul, a distension of the mind, spread out between what we remember, what we experience, and what we expect. In some sense, for Augustine, we do not simply exist inside time. We hold time within ourselves, the way we hold memory. This is a strange and beautiful thought to sit with, especially at night, when time seems to loosen its grip a little, when the ordinary rush of hours and minutes begins to soften into something slower, something closer to stillness. Augustine also spent much of his life wrestling with the oldest and hardest question in all of philosophy and religion. Why does evil exist? If there is a good and all-powerful source behind everything that exists, why is the world filled with cruelty, suffering, and wrongdoing? His answer, developed carefully over many years, was unusual. Augustine came to believe that evil is not really a thing at all, not a substance, not a force with its own independent existence. Instead, he argued that evil is a kind of absence, a privation, a lack of the good that should be present. Just as darkness is not a substance in itself but simply the absence of light, evil, for Augustine, is what happens when goodness is missing, damaged, or turned away from its proper direction. A cruel act, in this view, is not cruelty existing as a positive thing in the world. It is goodness, twisted, diminished, turned inward on itself, love directed at the wrong object, or love that has curled in on itself instead of reaching outward. Even the will that chooses wrongdoing, Augustine argued, is still, at its root, seeking something good, even when it seeks that good in a broken, disordered way. This led Augustine into a lifelong meditation on the human will itself. He believed deeply in free will, in the idea that human beings are genuinely responsible for their choices. And yet, he also believed, painfully, from his own experience, that the will alone often isn't enough. He knew what it was to want to change, and to find himself unable to change, not because he lacked understanding, but because his desires were divided against themselves, pulling in different directions at once. Out of this, Augustine developed his understanding of grace, the idea that human beings, left entirely to themselves, tend to remain trapped in old patterns, old loves, old habits, no matter how much they might wish, intellectually, to be different. He believed that some deeper help was needed, something beyond willpower alone, to reorient the heart toward what it truly wanted beneath its own confusion. This idea placed Augustine in a long and difficult dispute with another thinker of his time, a monk named Pelagius, who taught that human beings had full power, entirely on their own, to choose good and avoid evil, without needing any outside help at all. Augustine pushed back firmly against this view, insisting, from his own long and difficult experience, that human effort alone was often not enough to overcome the deep patterns pulling a person toward disorder. This disagreement, quiet as it might sound now, shaped centuries of later thought about human freedom, responsibility, and what it means to change from the inside out. Augustine also thought deeply about love itself, and where it should be directed. He suggested that much of human unhappiness comes not from loving things, but from loving them out of order, from loving lesser things as though they were the highest good, or expecting from ordinary things, from wealth, from pleasure, from the admiration of others, a kind of lasting peace that they were never able to give. He believed that the human heart was built for something larger than any single object within the world could satisfy, and that when we ask small, passing things to fill that space completely, we end up disappointed, restless, and empty, again and again, no matter how much we accumulate. This is the deeper meaning behind the line Augustine is most remembered for, the line we've already touched tonight. The heart is restless, until it finds where to rest. It isn't simply a poetic phrase. It's the conclusion of a long, lived argument, built from years of chasing pleasure, philosophy, ambition, and reputation, and finding each of them, in turn, unable to fully answer the ache underneath. In his later great work, The City of God, written as the ancient world was falling into crisis around him, with Rome itself sacked and the old order crumbling, Augustine offered a different way of understanding human history altogether. He imagined two cities, woven invisibly through every age, every nation, every human life. One city is built on self-love, taken to the point of contempt for anything beyond itself, a way of living organized entirely around power, possession, and personal advantage. The other city is built on a different kind of love, one that reaches outward, towards something greater than the self, willing even to set the self aside for the sake of that greater good. These two cities, Augustine says, are not simply nations or empires. They are two directions a human heart can face, two ways of ordering one's loves, present in every society, and often present within a single person, in tension, at the very same time. Augustine also turned his attention inward toward the mystery of God as Trinity, three persons in one being, and here too his mind reached for something close and human to help make sense of it. He suggested that something like this triune structure could be glimpsed, faintly, in the human mind itself, in the relationship between memory, understanding, and will, three distinct faculties, and yet one single, unified mind. Whether or not this fully explains the mystery he was reaching toward, it shows something important about how Augustine thought. He rarely stayed only in abstract argument. He kept returning, again and again, to the inner life, to memory, to time, to the divided will, to love, asking philosophy to help make sense of what it actually feels like to be a human being, awake in the world, searching for rest. He described his whole approach to faith with a phrase that has echoed for centuries. He said he believed in order to understand, not the other way around. Faith, for him, wasn't the opposite of thinking. It was the starting point that opened the door to deeper understanding, a kind of trust that made the searching itself possible. Augustine spent his final years still writing, still teaching, still working through these same questions: memory, time, love, evil, the restless human heart. He died in the year 430, as a foreign army laid siege to the very city where he had served as bishop for so many years, the old Roman world ending, once again, around him. And yet what he left behind did not end with him. His questions about memory became questions later philosophers would spend centuries returning to. His reflections on time still echo in the way thinkers describe consciousness today. His picture of a restless heart, searching for a rest that ordinary things can never fully provide, still speaks to something almost everyone recognizes in themselves, whether or not they've ever read a word he wrote. Tonight, you don't have to solve any of these questions. You don't have to decide what love is properly ordered toward, or what evil ultimately is, or where time actually lives. You can simply let Augustine's restlessness settle, for now, into something quieter. Let the palace of memory grow still and dim, its countless rooms falling gently into shadow. Let the present moment, that thin, fragile sliver Augustine wondered about, stretch out softly, without hurry, without anywhere it needs to go. Let the divided will, the wanting and not wanting, rest for tonight, unresolved, and simply let go. Thagist, Carthage, Milan, Hippo. A restless young man, chasing pleasure, chasing philosophy, chasing status, and, underneath all of it, chasing rest. A garden, a child's voice, an old book opened at random. A mother, waiting by the sea. A city, built not on power, but on a love that reaches outward. The heart is restless, until it finds where to rest. Tonight, there is nothing you need to search for. Nothing to chase, nothing to prove, nothing left to carry. Just let your body grow heavy. Let your thoughts slow, and soften, and drift. The restless heart can rest now. Sleep well. Rest now. Let's stay a little longer in Augustine's world, and then let's bring some of his ideas closer to home, closer to tonight, closer to your own ordinary days. To understand Augustine, it helps to understand the world he was actually living in, because it was a world coming apart at the seams, even if very few people wanted to admit it out loud. For centuries, Rome had felt less like a country and more like the permanent shape of reality itself. Roads connected it from Britain to the edge of Persia. Its laws, its language, its armies, had felt, for generation after generation, simply eternal, the fixed backdrop against which ordinary human lives were lived. By the time Augustine was a grown man, that backdrop was starting to crack. The empire was overextended, its borders pressed on all sides, its economy strained, its political center shifting and unstable. In the year 410, when Augustine was already an old bishop in Hippo, the unthinkable happened. Rome itself, the eternal city, was sacked by invading forces. For the people of that time, this wasn't just a military event. It felt like the end of the world as they understood it, the collapse of the very idea of permanence. People asked, understandably, how could this happen? Some blamed the Christians, arguing that Rome's old gods had abandoned the empire once it turned away from them. It was in direct response to this accusation that Augustine began writing The City of God, not as a calm philosophical exercise, but as an urgent response to people who were frightened, disoriented, and looking for someone to blame in the middle of real, historical collapse. This matters, because it means Augustine's philosophy wasn't developed in a quiet, comfortable study, detached from the world. It was forged in crisis, in the middle of political chaos, economic uncertainty, and the slow unraveling of a civilization that had once seemed unshakable. When Augustine wrote about restless hearts, about cities built on self-love versus cities built on outward love, about the difference between what fades and what endures, he was writing as someone watching, in real time, an empire discover that nothing built on power alone actually lasts forever. Toward the very end of his life, this collapse arrived at his own doorstep. A group known as the Vandals crossed into North Africa and laid siege to Hippo itself. Augustine died during that siege, in the year 430, with the sound of an approaching, uncertain future pressing right up against the walls of his city. He didn't get the luxury of a peaceful, distant ending. He died in the middle of the same historical unraveling he had spent years trying to help others understand. And yet, strangely, it's partly because of this collapse that Augustine's ideas survived and spread so widely. As the old Roman world faded, Christian monasteries and communities became some of the few stable institutions left standing, places where books were copied, preserved, and passed down through generation after generation. Augustine's writings, his confessions, his City of God, his letters and sermons, became foundational texts for the centuries that followed, read and reread by monks, scholars, and theologians all across what would become medieval Europe. Nearly every major Christian thinker who came after him had to reckon with Augustine in some way, whether building on his ideas or arguing against them. Centuries later, thinkers of the Protestant Reformation returned again and again to Augustine's writings on grace and the limits of human willpower, finding in his old arguments against Pelagius a foundation for their own reflections on human nature. Augustine's fingerprints are all through Western religious thought, sometimes openly acknowledged, sometimes so deeply absorbed that people no longer remember where the idea originally came from. But his influence didn't stay only inside theology. Augustine's reflections on time, on memory, on the strange inner experience of being a conscious self looking back at its own past, quietly shaped the way later philosophers thought about the mind itself. When modern philosophers ask what it feels like, from the inside, to be a person moving through time, they are, whether they know it or not, walking down a path Augustine cleared many centuries earlier, sitting with the same puzzle, the thin, vanishing present, the vast inner room of memory, the strange feeling of being stretched between what was and what is still to come. Even his method left a mark. The Confessions itself was something unusual for its time, a long, searching, deeply personal account of one man's inner struggles, doubts, failures, and eventual peace, written directly to God, but clearly meant to be read by others. In a sense, Augustine helped create a way of writing about the self that we now take completely for granted, the deeply personal memoir, the honest account of inner conflict, the idea that a person's private doubts and struggles are worth examining closely, and worth sharing. So when you come across someone today writing honestly about their own anxiety, their own divided desires, their own slow, uneven journey toward some kind of peace, there's a long, quiet thread running back, underneath all of it, to a restless young man in 4th century North Africa, trying to explain to himself why he kept doing things he didn't actually want to do. Now let's bring some of these ideas down from history, and let them settle into something closer to your own everyday life, because Augustine, for all his ancient language and his old world setting, was really writing about things that haven't changed much at all. Think about that small story of the stolen pears, the young Augustine climbing a tree not out of hunger, but simply for the thrill of doing something wrong. You don't need pears or a garden to recognize that pattern. It shows up in far smaller, far more ordinary ways almost every day. The extra scroll through your phone late at night, even though you already know it isn't making you feel better. The comment you can't resist making, even though you know it will only stir up conflict. The small, unnecessary indulgence, reached for not because you actually want it, but almost out of habit, out of restlessness itself. Augustine wasn't describing some rare, dramatic sin. He was describing something ordinary, something almost everyone quietly recognizes, once they're honest enough to look. Think about his reflections on the divided will, wanting to change and also, quietly, not wanting to change, at the very same time. This is one of the most familiar experiences of ordinary adult life. wanting to go to sleep earlier, and staying up anyway. Wanting to eat well, and reaching for something else instead. Wanting to have a difficult conversation, and finding a dozen small reasons to put it off one more day. Augustine wasn't writing about weakness as something shameful to hide. He was naming something almost everyone lives with, the strange experience of a mind that isn't fully unified, that wants two different things at once, and has to slowly, patiently, learn to choose. Think about his reflections on memory, that vast inner palace holding a lifetime of images, sounds, and feelings. You don't need to be a philosopher to notice this. A particular song comes on, and suddenly you're back in a car, years ago, with people who aren't in your life anymore. A certain smell drifts by, and an entire afternoon from childhood rises up, whole and vivid, though you hadn't thought about it in years. Augustine's palace of memory isn't an abstract idea. It's something you walk through constantly, usually without noticing, carrying an entire private history everywhere you go, even into ordinary moments like this one, lying quietly in the dark. Think about his reflections on time, on how the present moment is always slipping away the instant we try to hold on to it. This shows up constantly in small, ordinary frustrations. Rushing through a meal without tasting it, because your mind is already on the next task. Sitting with someone you love, but only half there, already thinking about tomorrow. Lying in bed at night, replaying the day instead of simply resting in the stillness of the moment you're actually in. Augustine's meditation on time is, in a strange way, an old invitation to something people now often call presence, the practice of actually inhabiting the thin, fragile now, instead of living entirely in memory or anticipation. Think about his understanding of evil as a kind of absence, a lack of proper goodness, rather than some separate, independent force. This offers a surprisingly practical way of looking at difficult people and difficult moments in your own life. Instead of seeing cruelty or selfishness as some solid, mysterious thing a person simply has, Augustine's framework suggests looking instead at what might be missing, what good has gone untended, undeveloped, or turned inward, twisted by fear, by old wounds, by disordered love. It doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does offer a quieter, less bewildered way of understanding it, as brokenness rather than as some separate, alien force of pure malice. And think, finally, about his understanding of love that has lost its proper order, expecting from small, passing things a kind of peace they were never able to give. This might be the most immediately recognizable of all his ideas. The promotion that was supposed to finally make you feel secure, and didn't. The relationship that was supposed to fill a certain emptiness, and couldn't, not entirely. The purchase, the achievement, the recognition, each bringing a brief lift, followed, sooner or later, by the same old quiet ache underneath. Augustine wasn't warning people away from pleasure, or ambition, or love itself. He was gently pointing out that these things make wonderful companions along the way, but they were never built to be a final resting place, a home strong enough to carry the full weight of the human heart. This is, in the end, what Augustine's whole restless search seems to circle back to, again and again, whether he was writing about memory, or time, or evil, or the divided will, or two competing cities of the heart. Somewhere underneath all of his questions is a simple, ordinary observation, one that doesn't require any particular belief system to recognize. Human beings keep looking for a place to finally set the weight down, and much of what we chase along the way, however good, however enjoyable, wasn't built to hold that weight completely. Tonight, you don't need to resolve any of this. You don't need to figure out where your own heart has been searching, or what small things you've quietly asked to give you a peace they were never able to provide. You can simply notice, softly, without judgment, that this search itself is old, older than you, older than tonight, older even than the crumbling world Augustine once watched fall apart around him. And for now, the search can rest. Let the vast palace of memory grow quiet, its countless rooms settling into shadow. Let the thin, fragile present moment widen out gently, with nowhere left to rush toward. Let the divided will, the wanting and the not wanting, simply loosen its grip for tonight. An empire once thought itself eternal, and it wasn't. A restless young man once thought pleasure, and ambition, and clever arguments would finally be enough, and they weren't. And in the quiet space left behind, once all of that finally stopped, he found something calmer waiting underneath. You can let that same quiet space open now. Nothing to chase tonight. Nothing to prove, nothing left to carry. Just let your body grow heavy. Let your thoughts slow, and soften, and drift. The restless heart can rest now. Sleep well. Rest now. Let's go a little deeper still, and spend some time with the actual books Augustine left behind, because each one carries its own particular mood, its own particular question, and sitting with them, slowly, tonight, is a little like walking through different rooms of that same vast inner palace he once described. The Confessions is the book most people meet first, and it remains strange even now, so many centuries later, because of how unlike anything else it was when it first appeared. Written near the end of the 4th century, it isn't a history, and it isn't a straightforward argument. It's addressed, from the very first line, directly to God, as though Augustine were speaking aloud in an empty room, thinking out loud about his own life, unafraid to admit confusion, unafraid to admit shame, unafraid to leave certain questions open and unresolved. The word Confessions itself carries two meanings at once in Augustine's use, and both matter. It means confession in the sense we usually think of, an admission of wrongdoing, a laying bare of old mistakes. But it also means something closer to praise, an open acknowledgement of what he had come to believe was true and good. The book moves constantly between these two senses, sorrow over the past and gratitude for where he eventually arrived, often within the very same paragraph. The first 9 books of the Confessions tell the story we've already spent some time with tonight, his childhood, his years chasing pleasure and status, his time among the Manichaeans, his slow drift toward Milan, the garden, the voice, the book opened at random. But then, strangely, the story stops. The final 4 books of the Confessions leave the narrative behind almost entirely, and turn instead toward pure reflection, long, winding meditations on memory, on time, and finally, on the opening lines of the book of Genesis, on creation itself, on what it might mean for anything at all to come into being out of nothing. Many readers over the centuries have found this shift jarring, wondering why Augustine would abandon his own life story just as it reaches its most dramatic turning point. But there's a kind of quiet logic to it. Once the outer story of his conversion is finished, Augustine turns his attention to the deeper question underneath it, not simply what happened to him, but what does it mean to be a self at all, moving through time, carrying memory, made by something greater than oneself. The story of his life becomes a doorway into these larger, stranger rooms of thought. Long before the Confessions, in the earliest days after his conversion, while he was still living quietly with a small circle of friends, Augustine wrote a shorter, gentler work called the Soliloquies. The title itself means something like talking to oneself, and that's almost exactly what the book is, an imagined conversation between Augustine and his own reason, personified almost as a separate voice, questioning him, pressing him, refusing to let him settle for easy answers. In the Soliloquies, this inner voice of reason asks Augustine directly what he desires to know, and he answers, simply, God and the soul, nothing more. The rest of the short book becomes an attempt to reason carefully towards some kind of certainty, testing his own thoughts the way someone might test the strength of a rope before trusting their weight to it. It's an early, unfinished work, and Augustine himself later admitted its arguments weren't fully worked out, but there's something moving in watching a mind so early in its new direction, testing its own footing, out loud, on the page. Round this same period, Augustine wrote a longer, more carefully constructed work called On Free Choice of the Will, framed as a dialogue between himself and a friend, working slowly through the question of where evil comes from, and whether human freedom is compatible with a good and all-powerful source behind everything that exists. It's here that many of his mature ideas about the will first take careful shape, the notion that the will itself, though genuinely free, can become disordered, turned away from its proper good, not because freedom itself is flawed, but because of free will can, tragically, be used to choose badly. Years later, Augustine wrote one of his most technically difficult and most quietly influential works, a long study called On the Trinity, which took him well over a decade to complete, revising it slowly, uncertain, by his own account, whether he had gotten it right even at the end. Here Augustine attempts something remarkably ambitious, searching not just scripture and doctrine, but the structure of the human mind itself, for some kind of reflection, however faint, of the mystery of three persons existing as one being. He returns, in this work, to that quiet observation we touched on already, that the human mind seems to contain something like a trinity within itself, memory, understanding, and will, three distinct powers, and yet only one single mind holding them together. He isn't claiming this fully explains the mystery he's reaching toward. He's suggesting that if human beings are made in the image of what they're trying to understand, then looking honestly inward, at the strange unity and multiplicity of one's own mind, might offer at least a distant, imperfect reflection of something otherwise far beyond reach. Another work worth resting with tonight is a shorter dialogue called On the Teacher, written as a conversation between Augustine and his son Adeodatus, the same son he loved so deeply and who died young, not long after they were baptized together in Milan. The book is, in part, a meditation on language itself, on how words and signs actually manage to communicate meaning at all. Augustine argues, somewhat surprisingly, that words alone can never fully teach anyone anything new. They can only point toward things, gesture toward them, the way a signpost gestures toward a destination without actually being the destination itself. Real understanding, he suggests, only happens through some deeper inner light of recognition, something words can prompt, but never fully deliver on their own. Reading this dialogue now, knowing that Adeodatus died so young, not long after it was written, gives it a quiet, tender weight. It's the closest thing we have to hearing that brief remaining time between father and son, working carefully together through a difficult question, side by side. Toward the very end of his life, under siege in Hippo, with the world once again falling apart around him, Augustine returned to nearly everything he had ever written, and composed a final, unusual book called the Retractations, often translated as the Reconsiderations. In it, he goes back through his own body of work, one book at a time, honestly noting where his younger self had been mistaken, where his understanding had shifted, where an earlier argument no longer satisfied him the way it once had. There's something remarkably humble about this final project, an old man, one of the most influential thinkers of his age, choosing to spend his last years not defending everything he'd ever written, but quietly correcting it, refining it, admitting, again and again, that his own understanding had kept growing and changing across an entire lifetime. Even Augustine's restlessness, it seems, never fully settled, not even into his own earlier certainties. Alongside these larger works, Augustine also left behind an enormous number of letters and sermons, hundreds of them, written to ordinary members of his congregation, to grieving friends, to fellow bishops, to people wrestling with doubt, or guilt, or fear. Reading these smaller, more occasional writings, you find a different Augustine than the one wrestling with the nature of the Trinity, a pastoral Augustine, patient, often gentle, sometimes sharply direct, always trying to meet the particular person in front of him exactly where they actually were. In one letter, comforting a grieving widow, he doesn't offer abstract philosophy at all. He simply sits with her sorrow, acknowledging it fully, before gently, slowly, turning her attention toward hope. In sermons to his own congregation in Hippo, he sometimes pauses his careful argument entirely, to speak plainly, almost conversationally, noticing that his listeners look tired, or distracted, or that a point needs to be said again, more simply, in different words. Underneath the grand theological arguments, there was always this other Augustine too, a working pastor, tending to real people, in real, ordinary difficulty. It's worth remembering, resting here tonight, that Augustine's philosophy never developed in isolation, in some quiet, undisturbed study, far from the noise of ordinary life. It grew directly out of preaching to a real congregation, answering real letters, comforting real grief, arguing with real opponents, revising his own earlier certainties as his life slowly unfolded. His most abstract ideas about time, memory, evil, and love were never separate from this ordinary, daily work of simply showing up for other people. Perhaps that's part of why his writing still feels close, even now, after so many centuries. It wasn't produced from a great distance, looking down at human struggle from somewhere calm and untouched. It came from someone still very much inside his own restlessness, still working things out, still revising his own earlier answers, right up until the very end, with an army at the gates and an unfinished life of thinking still open on the table in front of him. Tonight, you don't need to read any of these books. You don't need to remember their names, or their arguments, or which one came first. You can simply let the picture settle, softly, in the dark. A man writing directly to God, admitting his own confusion. A young man talking quietly with his own reason, testing his footing. A father and a beloved son, working slowly through a question about words and meaning, together, before that son was gone too soon. An old man, near the very end, going back through everything he had ever written, admitting, without shame, how much his own understanding had kept changing. That, too, is a kind of rest. Not the rest of finally having all the answers, but the rest of finally being at peace with still searching, still revising, still allowing an old certainty to soften into something wiser and less rigid, for as long as a life happens to last. Let that thought settle now, quietly, the way an old book settles closed on a table beside a low candle. Nothing left to figure out tonight. Nothing left to defend, nothing left to prove. Just let your body grow heavy. Let your thoughts slow, and soften, and drift. The restless heart can rest now. Sleep well. Rest now.
Tenebris ambulamus, sine luce perimus. Surge lux eterna, rompe vincla noctis. Veni, Domine, libera nos a morte. voces mortuorum clamat ex profundis tenebrarum. Celum obscuratum est, luna sanguine tincta, stelle cadunt in vacuum, et nemo eis videt. Quis nos liberabit ab umbra mortis suius, quis lucem afferret in noctem sempiterna. Miserere noli nos relinquere, in tenebris ambulamus, sine luce perimus. Surge lux eterna, rompe vincla noctis. Veni, veni, Domine, libera nos a morte. Lucem quevanturus est. Tenebrae descendunt super terram silentis, voces mortuorum clamat ex profundis tenebrarum. Celum obscuratum est, luna sanguine tincta, stelle cadunt in vacuum, et nemo eis videt. Quis nos liberabit